A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again. And so, here on Wednesday, it's time to talk about something else. And because of the upcoming release of Beetlejuice, it only makes sense that a certain thriller that also came out in the 1980s gets mentioned once again. I'm talking specifically about a classic film by Warner known as Gremlins. And yeah, if you're wondering, I probably will revisit this entire series itself because there have in fact been a lot of news about it in recent times. But on to the first film. The Gremlins films, of course, were directed by Joe Dante, the same man that had also worked on the likes of Piranha, the original of course, as well as Small Soldiers, Explorers, and a few other well-known thrillers from the 80s and 90s. And while he didn't necessarily work on that much more than all that, he still has had a lot of memories from a lot of people with plenty of nostalgia in mind. Gremlins, of course, was, believe it or not, the very first ever piece to have a PG-13 rating. They couldn't necessarily decide on whether to give this film an R rating, or G rating, or PG rating. So, they came up with the idea, along with the MPAA, to create PG-13. A bit of a way to neutralize this sort of diversion tactic. Whether PG or R, bring them together. And you got a whole new rating in mind. And that, 40 years later, we've had thousands of new entries regarding the PG-13 rating. And the MPAA does statistically list this as the most common rating in movie history. And who would have thought Gremlins would actually be the very first to pull it off? But with the 106-minute time lapse from start to finish, the runtime itself, of course, does accompany the likes of the intro and credits and many other things. It also stars the likes of Zach Galligan as the one and only Billy Peltzer. And Billy Peltzer, of course, lives in a small township. This township, of course, is about to celebrate the one and only Christmas. This was also one of the first iterations of Christmas being used as a backdrop for a horror/thriller film, with others at the time, of course, including Black Christmas, which itself was one of the first to make such a big impact. In any case, though, Peltzer is a gadget salesman whom is looking for a certain gift. And while Peltzer is indeed the son of the famous gadget salesman himself, well, it turns out that it's a bit difficult to find a certain gift to give to the holidays, especially towards a son. But as we know, when there's a will, there's a way. And the old man himself does manage to find just that. A certain gift in the property known as Chinatown, where he comes across a certain shop, pays some old visits to an old friend of his, a young man whom unfortunately has a bit of a restrictive father, but yet a little surprise comes around. A small creature known as the Mogwai comes around and basically intrigues Mr. Peltzer like none other. It's basically more than what could have possibly been an idea for a pet. The Mogwai is in fact a little guy who is just all sorts of adorbs, like you wouldn't believe. However, in terms of this sort of demeanor that it gives off, that actually does hide the true secrets to what it really holds. You see, the Mogwai is a pretty sensitive individual, and as you might have guessed, it actually is not readily available for consumers outside of the Chinatown property itself. And so there was a heavy restriction based on where it could go and what it can do. There were in fact a certain set of rules, a bit of a sacred thing that has been kept alongside the Mogwai since day one, but yet when Mr. Peltzer decides to just rush out of there with the Mogwai in hands, while he is told about the rules in terms of ownership of a Mogwai, He of course relays them out to Billy himself upon getting home, but yet, in terms of how well it goes down, while Billy does abide by the rules quite well, which are of course a 3-point system. Rule number 1 is to not let it get wet. Rule number 2 is to keep it out of sunlight. Rule number 3 is to not feed the creature after midnight. Ever. And of course, Billy does his best to try and follow those rules. Unfortunately, it doesn't go so well for him, because the Mogwai, which is now named Gizmo, unfortunately ends up getting himself a bit wet. And this wetness does cause him to bubble up and eventually burst out several small spawns. They apparently are Mogwais themselves. So basically what happens is that when the Mogwai gets wet, it multiplies. And if that's not crazy enough, with all these Mogwais in check, Billy has to ensure that they all get fed. And while he does so, it unfortunately, believe it or not, causes them to shapeshift into eggs all of a sudden. He has no idea what had happened, and eventually finds out that his alarm clock was disconnected, unplugged. And so, while it technically led him to believe that it was before midnight, it actually was after midnight that these Mogwais were fed. And we know what that means. They turn into eggs that eventually hatch. Scaly creatures called Gremlins emerge from the eggs and are ready to cause mayhem like you would never believe unless you saw the film for yourself. And I'm sure these new generations are going to be seeing this movie with tons of galore in mind. And you know what? Everything up to this point sure was like clockwork magic. You had yourself a nice written cast, a good storyline, with some challenging prospects that help keep our main character in check. And while he does try his hardest, he unfortunately has a lot to learn about the Mogwais. And it's just as we suspected from the man in Chinatown. There was a specific reason why the Mogwais were not readily available for adoption or otherwise to anybody. And of course, we definitely know the old Mr. Peltzer had a really bad sense of judgment there. But that's kind of what happens when desperation kicks in. You're trying to find something for your son, definitely be careful. Because whatever you wish for could possibly end in tragedy. And we know that this movie takes place during Christmas, but believe it or not, was released in June. The complete opposite. So, that's another detail I feel like I need to put out real quick. Time passes. The Gremlins, of course, multiply even further by getting wet and also eating constantly after midnight, causing even more of them to spawn. And so, it's as bad as a virus. Kind of like in the film Outbreak, which I could probably revisit. Probably. Anyways, though, it's not long before eventually a certain solution is made. Because after all this time, the Gremlins were out and about in the school, they were out and about at home, where the mother definitely pulls off some sick tricks. I mean, shoving a gremlin into a mixer, shoving a gremlin into a microwave, and all that. It really goes to show you don't want to mess with moms nowadays. But in any case, though, the Gremlins are eventually all let out to the movie theater where they all watch Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, even going so far as to sing the famous "Hi Ho, Off to Work We Go." And before you know it, Billy has himself a plan, along with Gizmo in tow. It's crazy that Gizmo actually survived this whole onslaught. Maybe because since Gremlins and Mogwais apparently originate from each other, I guess that's the whole reason that why Gizmo wasn't even killed by the Gremlins, by his own things, let's just say. Because let's be real here. Mogwai gets wet. The wetness allows Mogwais to appear, and the Mogwais are then fed after midnight, causing them to turn to Gremlins, and it's basically an ecosystem that might as well be closely relative to that of Ridley Scott's Alien, which itself was a bit of a story that I've talked about not too long ago. But above all that, Billy actually primes the theater and blows it up sky high. Yet, it's not over yet. Spike, whom is seen as the leader of the Gremlins, known for that peculiar white mohawk on his head, actually goes through to the local mall. A small shop, basically, in which that in the toy section primarily is where he basically takes advantage of a number of things. Billy pursues after him, Stripe shoots him with a crossbow, and Gizmo swirls around in a little toy car, as if things couldn't get any cuter, while terrifying action ensues. But it all comes down to one final push. All Stripe had to do was to get himself wet, and thankfully a fountain was nearby. But it doesn't go so well for him. Gizmo comes in, launches the car upward, and then pulls down on a nearby cord, allowing the blinds to open, revealing a sunlit skyline. The sunlight casts onto Spike, disintegrating him into bones. And just like that, we have a 40-year-old classic, the first of its kind in PG-13 history, and the first of its kind, well, one of which, at least, to be set in Christmas. Other movies of this kind, of course, would include Die Hard, and even more recent hits that have come around just as well. There also will, in fact, be another movie set in Christmas, but having a bit more of a negative setup that will come out this year. Who knows? If I carry on films I'm willing to talk about again long enough, maybe I'll add that to my upcoming films. But I still do have the entire month of September to work with here. And for Friday, I'll have one more film to talk about before the Beetlejuice release comes around, and eventually I make my way over to the theater and talk about that one. Otherwise, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.
Whenever I want, I usually get, and I'm thinking I want you, but I don't have you yet. I ain't got no tricks to be playing on you.